I mean, I guess it comes down to sustainability is for me, it's around cultural transformation. So it's about working in different companies, different industries. A lot of the challenges are very similar. It's this idea of what sustainability is, this idea of, kind of changing cultural transformation. This week we'll be looking at, I think, the fourth heat wave of the summer. How does that impact the way that people kind of, interact with a pub? It's not always going to rain at the right time for crops, and farmers are being more impacted.
If you were trying to inspire some of the people just getting into a sustainability focused career today, what would you say are the things they need to know in terms of how to influence the wider business and why it really matters?
Every team has got a role to play, just as every person on this planet has a role to play.
Welcome to the SmartResilience podcast, where we talk with leaders who are shaping organisations' approaches to sustainability and climate resilience.
From businesses like Specsavers to Green King and thought leaders at the cold face of research, we invite guests with interesting stories to tell, to share their own unique challenges, successes and advice.
Made for experts and enthusiastic amateurs alike, there's something for everyone.
We are your hosts. I'm Harish Basala, founder of SmartResilience. As an engineer and an innovator by background, I find myself drawn into climate resilience.
I'm Kizzy Beckett. My career working across some of the world's biggest brands fostered a keen interest in the impacts of climate change.
If, like us, you've enjoyed hearing from our guests, please subscribe to hear more episodes as they get released.
Today's guest is James Hubbard, Environmental Sustainability Lead at Green King, where he's driving ambitious decarbonisation and climate resilience initiatives across one of the UK's most recognised hospitality brands. With over 2 decades of experience spanning consultancy, manufacturing, energy and supply chains, James has delivered sustainability projects in sectors as diverse as brewing, automotive, textiles and renewable energy, often on a global scale. From managing complex environmental risk assessments in Colombia to leading Scope 1, 2 and 3 carbon reduction strategies in the UK, James brings a proven ability to turn sustainability targets into measurable impact. His work blends technical expertise, strategic leadership and a passion for practical solutions that align environmental responsibility with business performance. Really great to have you here, James. Welcome.
Thank you both very much. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's really great to bring your global expertise, James, into this podcast. But to start off with, could you tell us a little bit about your journey? How did your experience in biomass, supply chain, public sector, all of it really bring you into your current role at Green King? But before that, also see how you got to this role in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to sustainability is, for me, it's around cultural transformation. Yeah. So it's about working in different companies, different industries. A lot of the challenges are very similar, even though, we might be doing some very different sorts of things. So I think my experience started many years ago in consultancy, working in Colombia for an environmental and social consultancy, and sort of working on very specific projects around there. There was looking at environmental site investigations, there was auditing work as well. And then when my wife and I decided to come back to the UK to have a family, I started obviously looking for work here, and then found work in auditing on sustainability data, specifically around some government initiatives on road transport fuels as well. And that then kind of gave me the experience that led me into working in biomass, where I was in charge of looking at ensuring that the biomass we were using met the sustainability criteria of the EU at the time. It was obviously before Brexit, and so that was obviously a very focal part of what the company was doing. So my auditing experience led me to the other side of the fence, where I was looking at the management system and the assurance. And then from there I went into cotton and looking at traceability, that kind of drawing on the traceability of biomass. That then led me to work in cotton. And from there, I then went into automotive, where I worked as like the corporate sustainability person for a tier one automotive supplier. And again, elements of traceability, elements of understanding carbon emissions, and some of the strategy work that I'd picked up in previous experience as well helped me in that role. I went from that role into international development, which was that was a really interesting area to work in. Again, sustainability, looking at how do we make all these different projects that the organization was doing around the world, how do we build sustainability into those projects. And then from there, I've come to Green King, which is again kind of drawing on all of this sort of varied experience, but ultimately things like climate change are consistent there. Everyone's facing the same sorts of issues.
Well, listeners also tend to like learning a little bit more about your childhood. What shaped your world view? Where did you grow up, and how did you end up working in sustainability in the first place? And I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I grew up in Essex, and I guess I just we grew up in the countryside in Essex. So a lot of when summer holidays, you'd be out sort of playing around the countryside, leave home at 9 a.m. and don't come back till dinner time, but always outside in the countryside. And I mean, to be honest, I've always had a fascination with South America. I don't know why exactly that might be. Possibly the Paddington the Bear books. That might be the best kind of guess I have at that. But I always had this kind of fascination with South America. And I sort of went through school and chose to study geology at university, which again is a sort of connection to the natural world. But it wasn't like something I'd studied particularly before. It sort of appealed to me. It seemed interesting. From there, I actually went into construction and worked for a small construction company. We grew quite quickly, but actually I got one day, the day that sort of said to me, right, no, construction isn't for you anymore. I sort of turned up to a site in North Essex, and North Essex has got some nice rolling green hills, and it's a very nice kind of village out there. And I just got towards this site, and there was a whole side of the hill had been was being developed for a housing estate, and it was just one of those moments where it just seemed such a shame, and I thought I don't think I want to keep doing this. And so from there I sort of did one or two other things, jobs, while I'm trying to work out how do you start to transition to something I'm more interested in, and ultimately ended up going to Colombia as a volunteer. And it was in there I was just fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time. The ERM, the consultancy, were opening up their office and looking for an English speaking geologist. So it kind of just life aligned at that moment, and that started me on my route in sustainability.
And it's been quite a long road for you in sustainability, in terms of the different parts of sustainability you've worked in. Do you think it's changed much in terms of businesses' priorities around sustainability, climate resilience? Are they talking with the same language now and the same priorities as they were 10 years ago, for example?
Yeah, I think initially it's, my experience has certainly been that companies were maybe kind of focusing more on single projects. This idea of what sustainability is, this idea of kind of changing cultural transformation, this idea of, understanding all the environmental and social impacts in everything that we do, the decisions we make. I think that was still kind of not really there. And so, there was a lot of work on maybe very specific individual projects. There was definitely from those times as well, kind of the role of reporting that's, grown quite considerably. And that, I would say from my experience, there's definitely a period of time where, very small sustainability teams ended up spending a lot of time just on reporting, and this kind of drive to action, this integrating sustainability into everything the company does, that's a challenge just from a kind of time point of view. But I do feel now things are progressing. I think, this idea of climate change and the impact, there's much less pushback against this. Generally, there obviously still are some areas where people are quite vocal against it, but on the whole, I think people are accepting, they understand that we do need to take action. And so it does feel there's more concerted action coming together, collaboration within industry as well. So I think there's definitely a positive movement. There's still a lot of work to do around reporting. There's a lot of work to properly integrate sustainability into everything that companies are doing. But my sense is that it's moving in the right direction to actually taking action to make a difference.
And is there anything happening today that you'd have told yourself 10 years ago and you'd have gone, no way, there's no way that's happening?
One of the challenges for me was always this idea of integrating sustainability. So it always felt, like it's the sustainabilities team. It's they need to kind of think about climate change. And, if I go to sort of my manufacturing experience, engineering teams weren't really wanting to think about the carbon impacts of all the work that they're doing, the products that they make. It was very much you need to think about that as a sustainability team. And I think it's that. So I would love to go back 10 years and be able to kind of get more of this integration, more of this thinking around environmental and social impacts, because it takes some time. Once people start to think in that way, it is still going to take some time before you see actions. And obviously we are at a point now where, when we're thinking about the climate, we really do need to take action, and more than ever before. So I would love to go back and be able to kind of change that, get that kind of thinking, that understanding of what sustainability is, in place then, and we'd be in a much better position now with, bigger, stronger actions.
So you've got a varied career in terms of industries that you worked within. What are the consistent challenges you've observed for the businesses wanting to understand, mitigate impacts of climate change or climate resilience?
So I think one of the really big ones, and I think it's still to a fairly large degree is still a challenge now, is quantifying the risks. So there's definitely from reporting over the years, this idea of kind of understanding what climate risks are is, that's there, and that's, but that hasn't necessarily integrated into everything that the company does. And I think a really, important part of trying to move that on, so that, in all of these decisions, we are thinking about those climate level risks, is how do we quantify them? There's flooding as a risk, for in various projects in various companies that I've worked on, flooding has been a physical climate risk. But how do you properly quantify that? How do you say to the business that, in 10 years time, this particular flooding event or, flooding could cost you X amount of pounds? And I think it's kind of connecting that, is being able to quantify it, that's the real challenge. I think sustainability teams, around the world there's lots of actions that they know would help the business in the long run to be much more resilient, much more relevant as well in many ways. But it's hard to be able to say, if we don't do this, this is going to be the impact to the bottom line of the business. And so I think that for me is absolutely a key challenge for us.
So is that the one thing you'd like, if you had a kind of tool in your arsenal, or weapon, I suppose, if there's one thing you could bring into your day-to-day work, would it be that ability to quantify so you can make more things happen? Or is there another powerful weapon for you that you're just waiting for someone to develop?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, at this moment in time, for me, it's around what is going to help us move to action, as bigger, faster actions. And quantification definitely feels like a challenge now. Having it properly integrated, getting people at all levels of the business understanding kind of what these risks are, and actually the impacts, the proper impacts it might have to profitability long run, is also, something I think we're all kind of tackling. Around the physical climate risks, it's also, I mean, I don't know, it would be great if somebody could say, look, you're going to have a flooding event in 5 years' time, if there was a way of kind of bringing these fairly broad, flooding is an impact, but being able to kind of be much more specific around, look, it's going to be in this site, it's potentially going to be to this sort of degree, and that you're able to quantify these things. It does feel to me like everything sort of comes back to that. How do you get people to properly understand that the finance team, so that they understand the impacts of these things on the work that they need to do? So it does come back to quantification, but then sometimes you don't know the art of the possible. There might be other things out there. I go, oh yeah, I wish I'd said that. I wish I could foresee what's going to happen in 10 years time, and that would be great. But quantification is important at the moment for me.
You mentioned that quantification, financial teams, financial risk a few times, but Green King itself, it's more than just a business. It's at the heart of many communities, which that brings a whole new way to think about environmental responsibility, in that it's not just a business, but it has much wider social meaning to people and society in general. So from that perspective, when you think about risk, how does that fit in with the business goal?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of environmental risk and pubs and their place at the heart of communities, and what the business is over a period of time, the risks are, there's obviously the kind of the risks of is a site going to be impacted by some particular weather event. I think there's other elements to this as well, and I guess we're kind of, this summer we're starting to see some of those sort of come much more obviously to the fore. This week we'll be looking at, I think, the 4th heat wave of the summer, and then obviously with much more intense periods of heat, then potentially bigger, stronger storms. And how does that impact the way that people kind of interact with a pub? People go to the pub. The summertime is a place when people want to sit out in the garden. It's it's like the best time of the year from a hospitality point of view. But what happens if we're starting to see summers that are much more intense heat? Do people at some point start to want more air conditioned places? Do we have maybe in periods of intense rainfall, storm periods that fall on the wrong weekend, the bank holiday weekend, and how does that impact the pub? So I think there's elements here of risk that be really hard to understand how that will play out. But this is where I think kind of, this is also around this idea of integrating. How do we kind of understand all of these things, rather than just being at this kind of simple level of, a flooding risk is a physical risk to a particular property, but how does that impact the way the property kind of operates? In hospitality, obviously there's lots of communities, lots of people, coming to those places. Will that be impacted? That one's really hard to know. Time will probably tell on that one, but it's definitely this summer. 4th heat wave. That's not many summers I can think of over the years where we're having this sort of degree of temperature rise.
And you talk there about physical risk. I guess that would be quite different for you between your, there's lots of very old pub building, there's some newer ones, you've got very modern breweries, and in fact you've got, supply chain operating all around the world. Where do you see the biggest physical risks are coming in?
I think it sort of comes back to kind of previous comments, is there's, it's there are lots of risk registers that kind of, might raise, the risks of flooding or the risks of storms around the world impacting business. In my experience, hasn't really manifested itself in kind of creating big problems for companies quite yet. We've seen problems around the Suez Canal. You can see the impact of when there are, interruptions, where there are disruptions to supply chains, how quickly that can have really big impact. If I go back to my time in automotive, so supply chains in automotive, there's always a kind of an alternative route for supply chains. People are thinking in some supply chains around, if I can't move something via this route, is there an alternative route? That's the one industry where I've seen that. The impacts on supply chains, and I think it does seem to me that we're starting to see globally much more extreme weather, and in the UK we haven't necessarily seen it nearly as much as other parts of the world are being impacted. So I think there is a whole lot around the supply chains. I think, it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see more disruptions from, longer, drier summers or intense periods of rainfall. And with agriculture, it's not always going to rain at the right time for crops. And, I think it does feel to me, so from conversations with farmers when I'm trying to, understand our scope 3 emissions, etc., is definitely farmers are being more impacted in the UK. Yields are not necessarily as because it's too hot at the wrong time or too wet at the wrong time. So I think there's lots of impact there that we'll start to see potentially in the next few years. And then on top of that, the obvious one of, flooding. If people can't get physically to a pub, then obviously that would be a real issue. So I think kind of those areas for me are where the risks are at the moment.
What about your kind of supplier base? So, I'm talking about soft drinks, that kind of thing. Are you actively working with them to look at where they're sourcing their water from, for example, to make sure they don't have negative impacts on communities? Or is that a bit of a future step that needs to follow on later?
So we've started to directly engage our key suppliers on sustainability. So the approach that I want to take is to really build collaborative relationship. It's not so much around kind of these are my requirements, just make them, you go away and make them happen. I don't really see that, scope 3 and really the holistic challenges that we're facing are going to be achieved by doing that. So what we're trying to do and we're in early stages of this, but is to really take a collaborative approach. And it's, not as much, it's just as much, understanding the great things that they do, but also what are the challenges that they're facing. And Green King, we're in a really good position. We can kind of be a convening force. Not only can we, through understanding challenges, maybe there are ways that we can help to overcome those challenges, or that we've got challenges understanding what suppliers are doing, they can help us to overcome these. But also, are we able to kind of bring different suppliers together because we understand one's got a particular issue that somebody's got a solution for. So we're really trying to take a collaborative approach and understanding what all our suppliers are doing. I think it's at the moment it's kind of a step-by-step approach. You mentioned water there. I think we're trying to understand more around the carbon emissions. We've got the net zero target, and so how do we start to move the dial around the goods that we're buying? But absolutely, we're pushing for water to become much more important. I do know from the conversations with the big drinks suppliers who we have engaged with, water is obviously for them a really critical part of their business. So I do know that there's a lot of good work going on in those areas, and it's very much top of their agenda, and it's something hopefully we'll get to. But we are having these broad conversations around sustainability, so not just focusing on carbon emissions, though that's a key challenge for us. How do we move the dial on our scope 3 emissions? So we've got a focus there. But yeah, biodiversity and packaging and all of these are all part of the conversation. I think sustainability, you can't just look at the one area. Everything's connected. Yeah, it's all a system imbalance essentially. So carbon emissions, water, biodiversity absolutely need to be part of that same conversation.
You've stepped up into this role just over a couple of years ago. What are the realities on the ground that may have surprised you or challenged you, or your assumptions?
Yeah, so the realities that surprised me, I guess coming into the role, there's a distinct set of kind of challenges around Green King, and we have 1,600 pubs that we own and manage. We own 1,000 properties as well that we lease out. And then we've got 2 breweries. So just at that level, the sustainability challenges are in a huge number of small sites, and that kind of changes what you can do, what are the right actions, what's the right strategy. So that was definitely new for me. the nature of all of these small number of sites, and how do you then go around trying to set the right strategy that's going to work with you? Large number of sites, large number of different brands as well. I think that was one of the first kind of differences from previous experience that I'd had. This is my first time of where there's agriculture has been involved, and I definitely, from understanding more over the last couple of years around agriculture, that to me feels like, I mean, that's such a sustainability, it's critical area. It's bringing the environment and social together. I mean, there's no separation there of one or the other. It's the agriculture really kind of is a place that brings it together, and sort of understanding the challenges for, farmers and food supply chain, whether that's in the UK or around the world. That's been really, really interesting to understand, and also kind of what are the solutions that would make that wide scale meaningful change. There's no kind of obvious answers there, though I do think governments have got a large part to play in this particular area. And then I think kind of from my sort of impression of coming into Green King as well, what I was really enthused about was that there were already teams around the business were thinking about strategy. There was, trials were going on. There was actions happening to actually move things in the right direction, coming from, other kind of jobs, or certainly, a previous one where I was the corporate sustainability team, and you spend a lot of time writing reports but not getting to that point of action. It was really encouraging that not only was the sustainability team thinking about what needs to happen, but relevant teams around the business were thinking for their areas, what can they do, and then obviously this kind of going back to previous point, this getting to the point of action, people were actually doing and trying things, and that was so refreshing.
Brilliant to hear. And I guess you've talked to some extent already about the fact that net zero and trying to reduce your scope 3 emissions particularly is very much on the radar for you. Are there any other kind of quiet things that are being done, some of this action you just mentioned, that's happening under the radar that you're really proud of?
Yeah, I mean, Green King, should be proud. I think a lot of the work in the properties, so property decarbonisation, kind of ensuring we obviously have a lot of kitchens around the estate. There are a lot of kitchens now that either are electric or electric ready. So to convert as old gas equipment comes to the end of its life. So, I think there's a huge amount of work there, and also around technology insights that helps reduce energy usage. So I think there's a huge amount of work has gone into that. Green King's also working and pushing ahead on an initiative that's kind of collecting bottles from pubs and taking them to be washed and then to go back into reuse. So this idea of circular economy, which is there's a couple of pieces there's one piece of legislation, the EPR at the moment, which is absolutely designed to move a circular economy on in the country. And then we've got DRS, which is planned for a couple of years, deposit return scheme. And also, again, feeding into this idea of circular economy. So I think those two areas are definitely ones that, Green King should be really kind of proud of being a part of. And then I think also around the supplier sustainability work that we're doing, trying to kind of take a different approach to it, understand clearly what we need suppliers to do to help us meet our goals, but then how can we kind of expand that wider? How can we kind of build these long-lasting kind of relationships where we can discuss issues? I think that's also something to be proud of. It's a slightly different approach from how I've seen it done elsewhere, and I do believe that it will bear good fruit at some point as we build those relationships.
Really good projects going on there then.
Yeah, it's really exciting to be in and around them, and to see them happening, and hopefully they build momentum. And as I say, it does feel as though we're moving into a period now where it's easier to hopefully get action happening, and that they can keep progressing and scale up, and we can bring other parties buying into these things seriously, and get to this point of the right actions at the right time that help us to move the dial.
I guess one of the questions I had around this was, James, You mentioned a number of different initiatives, and previously this was sitting with sustainability or CSR, or it was previously also called ESG. Do you think this is now a board level issue when it comes to action, moving from reporting, or in many organizations, do you still think it's an ESG or a CSR?
Yeah, I mean, from speaking to, to various people working in sustainability, whether that's, hospitality or elsewhere, I think there's still work to do to get this, to get sustainability completely at the heart of kind of thinking around, decisions that boards are making. I think there are plenty of sustainability teams out there that kind of facing they're the sustainability team. They have to make things more sustainable without necessarily the business doing things particularly differently. I do feel as though, in Green King, the conversation is something the board are definitely thinking about, and there's lots of conversations around what do we need to do, what are the next steps that we need to take to keep moving the dial and keep progress in these areas. So I think from what I gather, I think there is quite a mixed bag still, but as I say, there does feel to be more and more momentum. I think there will, in the next few years, it will be harder. Governments are going to have to kind of push things as well. They've obviously most have Paris agreements. They need to make sure actions happen. And the more that, companies see actions being taken by others, the more it's then, they're feeling like they're behind the curve, and that helps them to then start taking action as well. So I think it still depends on the company, the context. I think how important sustainability is to the bottom line of companies is very much still, really important in this area. But at some point you would hope that kind of level of action, that momentum it just kind of brings everyone along, and many more start to buy into this as we would need them to get that level of action.
So James, you've stepped into this role just over a couple of years ago. What are the realities on the ground that surprised you or challenged your assumptions?
Yeah, so one for me, kind of going back to previous kind of experience that I've had is, at Green King we have 1,600 pubs. They're in a number of different geographies, from urban centres to, very rural sites. The buildings can be hundreds of years old. They can be just decades old. 2 breweries. That kind of nature of that kind of the variability of having a lot of small sites and what are the right sustainability strategies that kind of incorporate all of those, all the different brands that we have. I think that was one of the kind of the areas that was new to me, as well as the global kind of supply chain. So there's a lot of goods, whereas coming from manufacturing, it might be you're just buying components from another part of the world. You're buying food from different parts of the world, you're buying drinks from different parts of the world, you've got kitchen equipment, you've got all sorts of things, all these huge variety of supply chains. So I think for me, those were, areas that were kind of very new to me. And then sort of around agriculture as well. This has been my first time experiencing kind of sustainability and agriculture. And that was also, a new kind of understand some different challenges for me.
I would love to hear from you about if you were trying to inspire some of the people just getting into a sustainability focused career today, what would you say are the things that they need to know in terms of how to influence the wider business? I mean, you've talked a lot about that being one of the challenges, and why it really matters. So why should people start heading down that route as their career path?
I think it really matters because climate change is, as big a risk as faces the humanity and the world at this moment in time. And we are seeing so many changes to the climate at this moment in time around the world. There is undeniably, it's the right thing to be working in. I really do hope that sustainability, we will get to this point where people businesses, but just not businesses as well, but governments, the public in general, everyone understands just what we're trying to do with sustainability, just trying to understand the impacts that we all have on the environment. And so I think it's a really exciting place is to kind of be working in that and trying to drive that forward. So this is the level of transformational change that you don't often get the opportunity to work in. Do need a lot of resilience, I think, to do it. You're not always going to have an idea and be able to convince people that we need to take this path, or we need to consider doing this differently. You need to maybe have those conversations over and over again. Sometimes you have to have them and then wait a while and then try and pick them up again. So there's a lot of resilience involved, but it's absolutely, it's one of the few areas where you can, make meaningful change, not just to the company itself, but wider. If you're able to make positive change, for example, to agriculture, improve soil health in a particular part of the world or country, wherever it is, has an impact then on farmers as well, and that's livelihoods, and it's really this idea of kind of changing, transformational cultural change. It's just really exciting place to be in.
That's brilliant. I mean, it sounds like it's very easy to get hung up on the reporting and the kind of practical things, but ultimately it does, from what you've just said, come down to it's protecting the planet, it's protecting the way that we live our lives, because, we can't continue as we are doing without some inevitable interruptions. And it's something which requires people that are really passionate kind of leading it forward, because surprise, surprise, it takes resilience personally to build a good climate resilience picture. So it's really, really interesting hearing that from you. And I'm sure there are lots of people getting into the career now feeling quite inspired by that.
I hope so. I was the one bit I was going to add, I think, is also an element of kind of business relevance as well. So the idea of business resilience is becoming more and more becoming part of the terminology of sustainability. I think there's also an element, of relevance as well. So in 10 years' time, the customers then are going to be much more in tune, understanding what sustainability is, how climate impacts affect us. And they'll have much more expectations around this. So I think there's also this idea of relevance. What can we do today that's going to keep us relevant, keep the company in its position in the market, or move to a market leader maybe by taking decisions today that really kind of starts to create a much more sustainable business and activities. So I just thought I'd add that.
Totally true.
I think James, and I think what for me from this, I think the key thing that struck out really was around the complexity of the challenge. Given you mentioned 1,600 pubs, where each one requires probably a different way to plan against different types of risks, because they're not all in the same area, quite diverse. And I think that really is something that it has to be taken over by different parts of the business, everything from estate managers to finance to risk, insurance, sustainability, to be able to move the needle on that. So that really is quite interesting and an exciting challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sustainability is, again, to kind of echo something I've said a couple of times, sustainability is a cultural transformation. It's changing the way that everyone in the business thinks about what they do, and it's sometimes that's quite, that's people, don't find it easy to understand that. So, we're very well averse, obviously, to thinking about financial impacts, but how do you introduce thinking about the environmental impacts of a decision, and also overcome the idea that people think that will be the kind of the trump cards now that we're looking at environmental impacts. If it doesn't tick all the boxes environmentally, then we can't do it. where really we're trying to kind of just introduce this understanding of what the impacts are. And then sometimes what's right from a financial point of view, then there won't be the best outcome necessarily for the environment, but understanding those impacts allows us to start taking actions around mitigating them. And I think that's really important. So to understand that, to get to that level of understanding all the impacts, it unquestionably needs everyone in the business just to start to feel more and more comfortable with what this is, what the approach should be. When we understand the environmental impacts, what are the next steps that we should take? So yeah, you can't be a sustainable company if you're just relying on a very small team to do it. It has to be everybody involved, procurement, finance as well, human resources. Every team has got a role to play, just as every person on this planet has a role to play in helping us to reduce these impacts on the climate and be much more sustainable. So it's a huge amount of education and getting people feeling comfortable with these ideas.